This video is about applying a critical eye to sources or resources that you're going to encounter as you look stuff up for your consulting work. Arborists are, they're kind of like generalists. They know about trees, but they have to know a little bit of a lot of stuff, like plant pathology, mycology, entomology. These are all individual fields where people spend their entire careers studying this stuff, and we have to just know enough so that we can make recommendations to maybe consult one of these specialists. If you're someone who is coming into the field of consulting from a tree work background, the truth is there are a lot of arborists on tree crews that don't necessarily have educational background or don't have the drive to acquire as much information as they can. There's a reason why certain people choose to work outside. So the question then is, if you only know this much about all this stuff, how do you know if the information that you're learning is correct or not? The best way is to be critical about what you're taking in and to really examine where this information is coming from. This video is going to be long because I think this is really important and it's very fundamental. Here are my questions. You can start off, if you haven't done this before or you're not in the practice of it, you can start off explicitly applying it, maybe having a list of these questions or your own questions, and every time you encounter a text, a website, anything like that, look at it and ask these questions. It doesn't mean that you have to write off that source. You just have to go into it with a more critical eye. Number one, who wrote this or who produced this information and what's their background? Are they experts in this field? Is there something about them that lends legitimacy to what they've created for you to consume? Number two, what bias might this person or the platform on which this information is published, what bias may they have? It's basically, do they see the world a particular way, which means that the information that they're going to give you is filtered through that lens. Number three, does this person have this person or platform have an ulterior motive to present this information in this way? Number four, what platform is this information being published on? YouTube, scientific journals, websites, etc. And how much quality control or assurance is there? Are there eyes unrelated to the source, like a peer review, or is it just someone like me just putting their opinions on the internet? Number five, does this information sound too good to be true? Are there any counterpoints? And this one I'm not going to bring up as much in my examples, but number six, how old is this information? With books, it's easier to find, or articles from academia. Usually there's a date on it, but some information can be outdated, especially if it's something like research or something like maybe chemical treatments. They're always finding out more stuff about them along the way. So in this next part, I'm going to do a whole bunch of examples where I apply these questions to different types of resources and share how I think about them. I'm not going to be able to go question by question because sometimes they're sort of combined together, but you'll see after I get into it. Source, me, my YouTube channel, including this one and my other one, which is Arborist Study Guide. Who am I? Who is this person? I'm a consulting arborist, been a consulting arborist for about 10 years. Before that, I got a master's and bachelor's in a relevant field, horticulture, and I taught while I was in grad school. At this time, I'm about 3 to 4 years in business, more like 2-ish full-time, and I have done very little crew work. So right off the bat, you know that you probably shouldn't trust me about anything related to crew work, actually doing pruning, removals, that stuff. I don't have any of that experience. I'm not going to talk about it because I know that I don't have that experience, but if I did, then you immediately doubt. Good chance she doesn't know what she's talking about. Then what bias might I have? what ulterior motives may I have. I'll just tell you guys, like, my bias is that, or my lens is that I'm okay with development, even though sometimes it hurts from the context of trees when really nice trees are getting cut down. But I do feel that if someone purchases a property, they should be able to develop it as long as they're not causing harm onto their neighbors, like cutting their neighbors' trees down and stuff like that. So that is going to be contrasted with someone who is tree preservation at all costs. And there are arborists like that who are much more conservative with their recommendations. Ulterior motive, obviously, I want to be famous because I probably don't have enough friends in real life. Just kidding. I want to share this information. I think that there are plenty of arborists that should be able to access consulting, or even tree workers access the arborist credential. And there's a lack of information that's accessible, right? There's information out there, but you have to pay a lot of money for it, or you have to know people. I just like sharing this, and I want to maybe leave some kind of legacy in the future. My platform, YouTube, no quality control whatsoever. I plan my own videos. I maybe talk to another arborist about my topics. I edit them myself, and then I just self-publish. So yeah, this is purely my opinion, purely my experience, and you have to take that into consideration as you're consuming my videos as well. And counterpoints, do I offer other perspectives? I hope I do. Like, I try to, but if I don't, feel free to call me out on it. Yeah, so that's what that would look like, analyzing myself. And now I'm going to go into a whole bunch of different websites, because this is probably your main source of information now. Just going online, looking at websites. But just like there's a lot of good information out there, there is also a lot of garbage. So I'm going to run through 3 websites. So Garden Professors is a blog written by university professors, and their goal is to debunk myths surrounding gardening, looking at research specifically and seeing if there's anything in scientific studies that supports these claims. And if it doesn't, they just say it, and they may or may not offer some alternatives as to what you could do instead. I don't know if they get any ad revenue from their blog, but their motive is really to debunk myths. It is, however, on a blog, and this blog is not controlled by anyone in particular. The people who post on the blog are all associated with universities or formerly associated, so maybe there's a degree of wanting to present themselves in a particular way, so it doesn't reflect back on their institution. But otherwise, maybe at most they have each other to look at the posts, and that's kind of it. It's not going through some special process. And I'm not a consistent reader of this blog, but I'm sure that if the science supports the counter argument, that they will concede that point. They're not fixed on, every garden myth is a myth. The next website is UCIPM. This is the University of California Integrated Pest Management website. They have a physical book as well, but frankly, I mainly go straight to the website. This is written by, the information on here is written by university academics, professors, researchers, and they have a list of resources at the end. Their bias is towards science, right? They're professors, they're researchers. It's biased towards science. So if you are someone who has experience with a particular pest and you feel that you have tried particular chemicals on trees and they've worked for certain pests and diseases, but the studies don't show any proof, they're not going to take that anecdote. That is not what they're about. They will also be clear if there are no chemical treatments that are effective. So they're not necessarily just saying spray this insect, spray for this disease. They will say, you can't do anything about it except cultural care. As far as I know, and I can't confirm this, but there's no financial benefit that they get from producing all this information. If anything, I mean, it means that people aren't going to buy their books. They're representing the university, so they have to be really careful about what they put on the internet. And what I've seen being associated with a UC professor is that they peer review each other. They send stuff to their buddies who are also academics, and they make sure that they have their information precise before they publish it. And that's even for, little pamphlets and things like that. And the last website that I have as an example is Wikipedia. I admit that I actually do use this with caveats. So who gets to write stuff on Wikipedia? Anybody. So you don't know what their personal background is. You aren't going to know their biases and things like that. And there will be a lot of people that want to change things in Wikipedia to match their beliefs. So you really have to be concerned about that. One good thing is that I've seen often where someone else will come in and say citation needed, citation needed. So they have this, there must be enough people who are looking at these things to basically be like, I doubt this, show me your sources, prove it first. And that's great. One of the things that you can do if you're using Wikipedia, provided the information isn't super critical, like if you just needed to broadly know where a species originates from, that's not something that's super critical. But you can look at the end of the Wikipedia page for resources and go from there to find maybe more legitimate sources that aren't open for editing for everybody. Turns out that was not the last website I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about the private website, the websites that are run by private companies. And I'll just leave it to you to think about, let's say Bartlett, including the research lab, Rainbow Ecoscience, or a tree service. So it's going to depend, like, who is the person writing on tree services on their personal websites. That can be just the office person. It could also be a marketing person. It's not necessarily going to be an arborist. It could be, especially in this age, it could be someone who's using ChatGPT to generate some stuff. For private companies, there's a profit drive because even if they're giving the information out for free, one of the main reasons why they do stuff like that is to get customers or to maintain their customer base. As far as the platform is concerned, for a small tree company, there's no oversight whatsoever. They just put whatever they want on there. For a larger company like Bartlett or Ecoscience, maybe there probably is internal review because they don't want to misrepresent themselves, but it's still going to be review most likely by people within their own companies. There are companies that will still be associated with services, right? So even if Bartlett Research Lab is completely independent from Bartlett Tree Service and they have, they've got independent funding, they may be completely separate and ethical, but we don't know that, right? As consumers of information that's put out there in public, we can't know that for sure. If there's any kind of profit associated with that company, there's gonna be a little bit of an internal struggle. So it's not necessarily whether there's truly a conflict of interest, but whether there's the public has that perception. The next category of information-ish would be like ChatGPT or AI. I think I don't have enough experience with this, and I probably won't gain more experience with this because I personally have stopped using it. But I have some thoughts based on what little I've seen. My understanding is that the models will start to respond based on the way that you respond to its responses. It will slowly change its language and maybe confirming certain things that you say. My assumption is that you can make this more neutral and balanced by asking it questions in particular ways. So motive, there's going to be profit involved. There, you may be using a free option, but there's always this hope that you go for the paid subscription. And over time, maybe they want you to become dependent and to welcome them as our overlords. The next next category is like platform. So I wouldn't say it's the website itself, but rather what it sources from. And my understanding is that it trains itself on a lot of models train themselves on information that's available on the internet. But the internet is a cesspool of information. You get stuff like the UCIPM website, which is super solid, and then you get some random person's blog, or you get Reddit comments, which is just someone who doesn't, a lot of the time, someone who doesn't know what they're talking about something they don't know. So you don't know where they're sourcing this information from. My assumption is that you can ask for sources. So if you could do that, and then double check your sources, because there have been cases, I think actual legal cases, where the sources did not exist. And I heard about this at Aska Academy, that people were citing sources that didn't exist. And that was a very clear way for their coaches and their instructors to flag them as using AI. One of the instances that showed me that maybe these arborists who are using it really don't know where they're going wrong, they don't know enough to know that they're wrong, was actually in the Aska forum. One arborist posted in there, he said he asked ChatGPT or AI or something to explain code it, and he pasted the answer in there. He did not give any indication as to whether he thought that this was correct or not. But because I had just reviewed code it for a video, I was reading that and it got the information wrong. For someone who's less detailed and maybe less experienced, how are they going to catch that? Did this other arborist catch it? I don't actually know, but that's a real problem. And that doesn't just apply to ChatGPT and stuff like that. It's with all information in general. So if you're going to use ChatGPT or other AI models, just make sure that you get enough information to be able to double check the information somewhere else. This next category I have is going to be a little bit different from the previous ones, and that is anecdotes, talking to other people. There are a lot of things that you cannot explain well enough, like you can't articulate, because it's just based on your experience. At some point it's a gut feeling, or you're going on like vibes or something, but you're not gonna put that in a book. An example would be what size roots and how many and how close to the trunk. What is my comfort level with cutting these roots during a construction project? I could never explain that to someone. But this is the source of a lot of information. I exchange this information with multiple arborists all the time. When I need a second opinion, I will ask, like, hey, I'm dealing with this situation. What's your experience been like? And that's one way that we can learn from other people. But you do have to consider their background, consider their experience. As an example, using the same example with construction related projects, if there's an arborist, I know many arborists who work in the tree service, own their own tree services now, and I'll ask them about pruning. I'll ask them about pruning, response growth, maybe removals, but I won't, or air spading work, but I will not ask them about root pruning. I won't ask them about diagnosing issues or things like that, because these are things that they don't have that much experience with. You can sometimes tell based on the behavior of the other person whether you should listen to them or not. One would be nuance. I think the less experienced arborists it seems like a lot of them are just more sure of themselves. And I understand the industry, at least, especially the tree work side, there's a lot of toughness, ego. It makes sense. But generally, the more you learn, the less you know. I've heard this often, and I still feel that now. The most knowledgeable consulting arborists that I know, the ones that are basically just ready to retire already, they say even with things like appraisals they've done many, many times, and they actually get less confident as they progress. Things like root pruning, whatever. And I think a lot of that is because the more as you proceed, you start seeing situations that disprove your current experience. And then you're just like, well, I just can't know anything, I guess. Um, yeah, like I think that's a real thing. So if someone is really sure of themselves, don't seem flexible with their opinion, if they're really confident, especially overly confident and arrogant, those are people that you want to be skeptical about. You might also look at their professionalism, how they carry themselves. I had a client who got a second opinion from another tree service. Actually, you got 3 opinions total, but one guy was just like flipping out, like, this is such a dangerous situation, like this tree has to go immediately because of these roots that you cut. I think it's because he just didn't have a lot of experience with construction, and he immediately jumped to this extreme reaction. Whereas the second arborist and myself, we were more like, I think you're okay, like this is not ideal, but this, I think you can keep these trees. And this is the kind of perspective that I see often online, especially on Reddit, where people will see like some small roots get cut, and small is subjective, but what is tolerable to me and what I've seen, they will flip out and they'll say, oh, that's a hazard, you got to take that tree out. To summarize this category, I would say just ask questions, hear what they have to say, what their experience is like, and then verify that information. And over time, you will get a sense as to whether that person knows what they're talking about or not. But even if they don't know what they're talking about in a particular category, there may be other things that they do know about. The next category, which maybe you would wish that this wasn't the case, is books. You do need to still have a skeptical look at books. You would think that because they're published, that they would be a source of legitimate information, but that's not necessarily the case. You can still apply the same view towards the books. There's a couple of books that I wanted to mention just as quick examples. The first one is Up by Roots. I'm gonna be honest, I haven't read this book in its entirety. In the section that I did read, it was talking about soil science, and it was kind of off. Like there were some details that did not match the soil science textbook that I was also reading, and that immediately made me like it increased my skepticism towards this book. So in looking at it, who wrote this? A landscape architect. There are a lot of landscape architects who are also arborists out there. And I think that the landscape architect would be a trustworthy source on stuff like, design, hardscape, the construction components. Landscape architecture is a huge ass career in its own. And I can't see someone being a really good landscape architect and being a really good arborist at the same time. Some of my thoughts around this book is it's written by a landscape architect, so I might question the science and the arboriculture components. The publisher is the ISA, compared to one company that just focuses on publishing, and then you have another company, our professional organization, that also happens to publish. So I'm not saying that they're not going to be good at it, but it's something that makes me wonder, and it's a wondering, which is good practice. The next thing is the arborist study guide. Every single chapter is someone's career. The goal is not for it to be the resource that you base your career on as an arborist. It's meant to review these concepts and go over them really quickly. I have seen errors in there, even though there are a lot of PhDs, professors who contribute to the writing of this book, it's not their book. Maybe, I don't know what the process is. Maybe they've contributed a paragraph or two or something like that. But for example, the very clear one that I caught was about symbiosis. There's three categories: commensalism, mutualism, and parasitism. And I think now they have competition or something like that. But the study guide says symbiosis is mutualism. That's like a high schooler could catch that and say, that's not true, is it? So that made me really start questioning, honestly, some of the information that was in there. So at this point, when I'm making videos for my other channel, I look at the study guide, but I don't use the study guide to create my videos anymore. I use other resources, the textbooks from these individual industries. That's what I'm using, because the study guide is not necessarily a trustworthy source. The ISA is publishing this book that they benefit off of because of the certified arborist test, even though in the book it says that this should not be the only or the main resource. Like, the test is not based on this book, something like that. But it's like this loop, right? They administer the test, they sell a book that caters to a test, and it's kind of a loop. But at the same time, I would say that it really is the only reference out there that will help people get information for the test in a single book. I have a selection of books here about tree law, and I'm not going to go through every single question, but real quick. This book, Understanding Tree Law, Handbook for Practitioners, written by Barry Bonaparte. She is a well-known tree attorney. This publisher publishes for legal professionals. So that would tell you that this is probably pretty good, good source of information. This is Arboriculture and the Law. It is older, but it's published by the ISA. The authors are both attorneys. So that would be good from a legal perspective. Probably not an arboriculture perspective for both of those. And here's California Arboriculture Law. This is self-published, I think. It's written by Randall Stamen. He is an attorney at law, and he is also an arborist. So that's good, except self-published. Makes you kind of wonder what the quality control is. That's something that I will pay attention to while I'm reading that. And then Tree Law Cases in the USA by Lou Bloch, published by himself. And I did a review on this already. And yeah, basically, like, if you're publishing it yourself and you're an arborist, but not an attorney, then you just have to read it from that perspective. And that's like an interesting little comparison of these books that you can acquire just relating to trees and laws. And you can see how different they are. Who publishes, who wrote it, what's their experience, and so on. The last category of information is research articles or journals. And I think a lot of people expect, especially if you don't have a research background, is that this is where the good information is coming from, right? Where the new information that's going to change things up, like, this is where it's coming from. And to some extent, that's true, but there are a lot of limitations that apply to these research articles when you read them with the hope of applying them to the practice of arboriculture. They will gradually inform our practice, but you cannot take findings from a research article and immediately apply it to your practice. So a lot of research articles are going to be behind paywalls. You're going to have to pay a lot of money to get access to them unless you're part of a university. For us, the place that you're going to most likely be able to get access to research articles is the ISA's Arboriculture and Urban Forestry Journal, and you get that with your ISA membership. This is a peer-reviewed article, double-blind peer-reviewed article, which means that when the researcher writes their paper, they send it in, they scrub the researcher's name and identifying information, send it to someone, and that person doesn't know whose research they're reviewing. if they can figure out who it is, because again, tree research is probably kind of niche. If they can figure out like, hey, I think I know who this is, then they have to excuse themselves from the process, because otherwise there's bias. And then when the reviewer sends the information back, the reviewer's information, like identifying information, is scrubbed away so that it's neither party knows the other. So this double-blind peer review is very common with research articles. What an experiment is like is, first you come up with a topic that's relevant, and it has to be important enough that you can get funding for it. Then you develop a hypothesis, which is something you want to prove or disprove, and you design your experiment around it. So it can't be a super general question or hypothesis like, this fertilizer is going to make the tree healthy. You can't test that. You would have to say nitrogen fertilizer in this form, and these are the components of health that we're going to measure to determine if it improves health, like the leaf color or respiration, I don't know, whatever. That's what it has to be, measurable and testable. And when they're designing their experiment, they're going to try to control for every possible factor, like the species, the age, the conditions under which the plant are grown. So you can see that really it's this isolated, like you're really only testing this really narrow component, and no part of practical arboriculture is like that. It just doesn't quite apply. And if you have research that is based on young trees, even something like a 50-year-old tree, you can't take that and apply it to a 100, 200-year-old tree. This is just a completely different situation. But as the body of research grows and you have these experiments that kind of work, that add on to each other, you can get more of a common theme around what you could or couldn't take out into the world and apply a little bit more broadly. The findings of a particular experiment honestly only apply to that scenario. So maybe it only applies to Acer rubrum 2-year-old, 3-year-old in greenhouse conditions. That finding could be different if you took those trees and you put them outside. So that's the limitation with research. What you might be more successful with is what's called a review paper. And that's where someone has just looked at all the literature, all the existing research on a particular topic. There was a literature review/review paper in the latest issue of the Arboriculture and Urban Forestry Journal. I think it was on mulch. You can also look at the impact factor of the journal, which is a measure of the prestige of a journal. The higher the number, the more prestigious it is. And that's established by how many people cite the articles are found in that journal. There's issues with that. I'm not super familiar with it myself, but sometimes, people want to publish in higher impact journals because that has a better, that reflects better on their career. The journal has to be within certain indexes to be rated. I was not able to find the impact factor for arboriculture and urban forestry, but here's impact factors for other tree-related journals I found. You should look at what date that article was published, because there may be newer research that has added to it or conflicted with it. You can also look at, when you're looking at the article itself, how well is it written? There are research papers that are written that look like research papers, but when you start reading them more, they're not well written at all, which, they're trying to write in English, and maybe English is their second language, but there's misspellings, there's, grammar, whatever issues. The misspellings are the worst part, because that's something that could have been caught a lot easier, and it gives you an idea of what the quality control might be like of that journal. And as far as ulterior motives are concerned, this one's a little bit tricky, because even researchers in academic settings, like professors, they're required often as part of their position to do research. And part of doing research is you publish. There is an incentive to work on stuff that will, one, get funding, two, get published, and to have results that are noteworthy enough to be published. And this can be problematic in situations. I've heard of people interpreting their data in specific ways to find significance in it so that they can publish. Because if you have a research project that's kind of a dud, like, oh, these things have no impact whatsoever, or if there's no statistical significance between any of their treatments, the things that they're trying to test, then it just, like, stuff like that doesn't get published as often as something where you actually have a significant difference. Basically, people are less likely to publish results from a experiment that essentially failed than they are to publish from something that quote unquote succeeded. Check out my puppy. I'm recording this video after I finished rough editing the previous parts, so I don't want to put my mic back on and I'll try to fix my audio in the future. But basically, I wanted to conclude the video by saying, why did I make this? Like, I wanted to basically encourage people to have skepticism, kind of like a trust but verify sort of situation towards new information that they're acquiring, especially from sources that they haven't vetted before. If you've vetted the source, I mean, still, when new things come out, it's always good to continue to question, just because, I don't know, I think it's good practice. You know, if you've ever wanted to be a grumpy person, or you wanted to be a hater, like, this is really the place to do it and to get that practice in, because the recommendations and the knowledge that we possess have, and that we give to people, have real consequences. It's not like social media where someone might just be making a recommendation on, you know, what products to buy, you know, improve your life, this and that. Like, we can impact people's finances by making recommendations on their trees. We can impact them by, you know, the hazard evaluations and things like that. So it really behooves us to do that level of questioning. And I'll be the first to suggest that you look critically at me. You know, for example, I could be giving free, high quality information, or I also could be spreading misinformation to a new generation of consulting arborists so that I can sabotage my competition. And you'll have to figure that out for yourself. Puppy.